Record to the cloud.
Record to the cloud.
Okay, should I see something on my screen?
Yes, it says in the upper left, it says recording.
Yes, it does.
We
Does
all
that
see
mean it's
that.
recording?
Yeah.
And I have it too.
We all
Okay.
see it, yeah.
Okay, everybody, this is going to be permanently on the internet, so watch what you say. You know how these things go. People say things and then they run for office in 20 years and they get accused of saying things they said when they were much younger. So if any of you are planning on running for public office in the next 20 years, I should warn you, be careful what you say.
Somehow I think that even if you weren't recording, they'd find out.
That's true. Everything leaves a trail. You know, nowadays you can't be too careful what you do and what you say and everything else.
Nope.
You know what we know what that's like. Okay. We had been talking about conscientious objection, and the last time we had again, I always like to do a little review as we begin. While we had spoken how the United States does allow for conscientious objection, and uh, through quite a process, the United States allowed for Jews to be conscientious objectors, including myself. I appeared before my draft board and did my 2 years of alternative. You had to do 2 years alternative service. Typically, they would say in a place not near where you lived because they wanted to be some sort of a hardship. But it was difficult to find something, and so what I did, I spent 2 years teaching in a high school for pregnant teenagers. I think I mentioned that before, that the high school principals in New York City school system could expel pregnant students in those years, which sometimes they did. And they were sent to a series of different high schools, including the first one that was established in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which was where I taught for 2 years. Strange as it may seem, half the faculty were COs. Because we all had to do something for a couple of years, had a low salary, and it was a very good experience in many ways. So now we were talking about, what about the IDF? What about the Israeli Defense Forces? And when we started to look at this, we want today to look at how that works out in Israel, and understanding that Israel, of course, is a very different socio-political entity than the United States. Morning, Fran.
Morning.
Oh, by the way, we are not meeting next week. Oh, by the way, let me just announce that. I've volunteered to be a poll watcher. There's a national,
Oh my.
there's a national organization that was a lot of clergy that one of my friends told me about. Excuse me. So he and I, there was a little training we went through. So across the country, there are going to be poll watchers that just to where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay, here we go. So we several hundred people went through training, and I got my badge, which I'm going to be wearing in Philadelphia, a poll chaplain peacekeeper. That's my title. Want to keep the peace at the poll places, and we'll be standing outside of a polling place in inner city Philadelphia. That's was the closest. They want to put people in the what do you call it? What are those states called? The
Swing state.
swing states. Thank you. Yes, the swing state. So the nearest swing state here, of course, is Pennsylvania. So that's what I'll be doing next week on election day. So we will not be meeting. Okay. So again, let's go back to our topic here, which I assume all of you can see. There we go. Is that all clear now on your screens?
Yes.
So as we started last week and we began this, and with the issue of how does the state of Israel deal with the issue of conscientious objection of individual conscience versus the coercive power of the state, given that Israel's army plays a very different role in society than it does in the United States. So we began to see that we do have people, conscientious objectors in Israel, Sarvanim, and yes, the vast majority of Israelis who are eligible, we're not talking about yeshiva students, that's a whole other political issue, which is right now, even as we speak, is being debated in the state of Israel. But the question is, can or should Israel allow? Now, remember, when we looked at some of the sources, Rabbi Norman Lamb made it very clear he felt that conscientious objection was a state issue. There was selective objection, but it was only by the state. Once the state made the decision to go to war, there was no allowance for selective conscientious objection. Now, when we spoke about the beginning of this last year, right? Refusal to serve was legal on the grounds of unqualified pacifism, but selective refusal, which accepted some duties and not others, was illegal. Okay. By the way, that is that's the same way the law stands in the United States today, as it has been in the past in the United States. It is not selective. Okay. Selective would weaken the ties that bind us as a nation. Needn't we say, unnecessary to say that Israel is a vibrant democracy with very strong opinions on various political issues. And quite frankly, there are very strong differences about certain aspects of the state, okay? Now, here's the statistic. 9.5% of the applicants who filed for an exemption from service or conscientious objections were granted it, i.e., that's very low. We can see that in general, what happens in Israel, the whatever equivalent there is, and we'll see that in a few moments, to American draft boards, in general, do not allow for it. They certainly do not allow for selective, okay? And there are some examples we started taking a look at. Let's take a look at some of the examples. And some of the examples, I think, are within recent times. For example, you may have heard of the Yesh Gavul. Yesh Gavul, there is a limit. Movement founded in 1982 at the outbreak of the Lebanon War. Unfortunately, as we know, they're fighting again in Lebanon by reservists. Remember, the Israeli army, people are drafted, serve their 3 years, and then until I think it's age 40, I could be wrong about that, they're in the reserves and they have to do what's called miluim. There are times of reserve duty that all Israelis up until that age are required to do. And the society and the businesses and everybody understands that. Where are you? I'm on miluim this week. That's what happens, because the Israeli army in general is not a very large standing army. The large standing professional class is relatively small, and then the army calls up reservists when there is need. That's how it works, okay? So a petition was signed by 3,000 reservists, some of whom were court-martialed and served time in military prison for refusing office orders. And that was, again, a question of selective. There is a limit, i.e., we will defend the state of Israel, but we didn't feel that going into Lebanon was something that we could in conscience agree to. As we know, there was an agreement to end that where the Hezbollah was supposed to stay north of the Litani River, which of course they did not, right? I mean, that's why Israel is back there today. There have been other examples. 2002, 51 reserve soldiers. Now, these numbers are not particularly large, as you can see, but they are suggestive that in Israel, when we talk about issues of individual conscience, most of the time, we're talking about people who have reservations about the Israeli military operations of that time. Okay, good morning, Judith. Good to see you.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So here's another example. 2002, 51 reserve soldiers signed a combat troops letter which declared their refusal to fight beyond the 67 borders in order to dominate, expel, starve, and humiliate an entire people. So this is also, again, a question as to where they were willing to serve at that time. And again, another example, 27 reserve and active duty pilots who said, we veteran and active pilots alike who served and still serve the state for long weeks every year are opposed to carry out attack orders that they felt were illegal and immoral. So there were those who, again, who felt that there were some of the actions were not permissible. 2014, the first public collective refusal by intelligence officers, 43. Again, we're not talking large numbers. Published a letter in Yedidot Achronot, decried the use of espionage to set up airstrikes that have inflicted casualty among civilians. As we all know, this issue of the Hamas intentionally setting up its military bases among civilians creates a moral dilemma where they intentionally set it up in a place where if they're attacked, civilians are going to be killed, and they don't seem to care, right? We would not imagine the United States military setting up a major base in the Fairlawn High School. We might find that to be objectionable, right? I mean, but that's what, of course, Hamas does. And there were issues, and we find again many other times, the attempt to harm through calls to refuse to report for duty. Again, this is reservist, based on claims that are incongruent with the unit's ways and the values of the soldiers, is a base and distasteful attempt to aid the hateful and dishonest anti-legitimization campaign being led around the world against Israel and the IDF. So there is another factor here in Israel where Israel feels, correctly so, that it is always being attacked unfairly, certainly not the way that other nations who do things are allowed to do things. So the question is, the selective refusal here, is that give aid to the enemy? Okay. Okay. Let's go down. Again, so what happened? They were disciplined. 200 denounced the letter as shameful. And so again, we continue to see this. In 2013, 200 Israeli youth released an open letter. And yet, despite all this, what happened after October 7th? As we all know, Israelis from all over the world, wherever they were, came back to Israel to fight, not knowing that this was a fight for Israel's survival. Okay, any comments or questions to this point about what happens in Israel? Okay, this is source number, let me just be sure I got my sources right. This is source number, okay, refusals up. Let us continue. Now, second. Okay. So what does happen? I was able to find an article. Article was written, stated, here it is, March 2021. So what happens to an Israeli who decides that they are a conscientious objector? Again, a very small number of people. This is Hallel Rabin, 19-year-old Israeli, and she was been in the jail. What happens if you refuse to serve in the IDF? A majority of young Israelis are granted service exemptions for ethnic or religious reasons, and mental health exemptions are notoriously easy to obtain. Being a conscientious objector is a far more difficult and demanding path. So I have this article which talks about a young woman. Both of her parents served in the army. So she herself, it seems unfair. She had a recruitment date. She told the army that she was a pacifist, refused to enlist. She was promptly tried and jailed. To get conscientious objection status in Israel is very difficult. In late November, after 4 stints in military prison, a total of 56 days behind bars, she was finally recognized as a conscientious objector and discharged. In other words, the Israeli military, I think, is correctly concerned. They basically had this woman. We said, well, we don't think you are. You're going to have to suffer the consequences. And after they saw that she was willing to serve for 56 days in prison, they granted her the CO the status. Jack, I see that you're here also. Good morning. Okay. All right. According to the IDF, 12% of the candidates were granted a full exemption for reasons of mental health. Does that sound right? 12% of all the 18-year-olds had a mental health exemption. It sounds like a bit of a loophole. And my guess is that it probably is. Some, if not most, of the thousands of people represented by those figures, no doubt suffer from mental illness. But receiving a mental health exemption is notoriously easy, allowing the IDF to accommodate the desires of a growing number of young draft dodgers while granting plausible deniability to others. Okay. So we see how the Israeli military deals with this. In the United States, where it's easier to get a conscientious objector status, the Israeli military kind of has this, excuse me, I'm still coughing a little bit, way of doing it. This woman said she didn't want to do that. So she went before the Conscience Committee, 4 officers and a civilian academic. Okay, so they tried to figure it out. Genuine pacifists are exempt from serving, and there was a hearing. And, you know, there are Israelis who politically have disagreements with the occupation. But this woman says, I object to the essence of any military. No, they asked her if she would serve in the Swiss Army. The Swiss Army, let's face it, is known for not having to engage in too many battles, if any. And she said no. Optimistically, my chances were 50-50, but realistically, I knew it was more like 70-30. For some people, prison is the goal. They say my refusal is political and I'm going to prison to make a statement, but I made a real effort to convince them that I was a true conscientious objector. I wasn't successful. So she went to prison. After 46 days, she appeared again. And then she was sent to prison again. She was a good prisoner. She was good in prison. Eventually, they kept telling me that our army is the most moral army in the world. And I think that's a safe statement. But an army is immoral by definition. Well, yeah, if you agree to the fact that a country needs to take military means, it is inevitable. First of all, there are going to be some civilian casualties, and you cannot make those fine distinctions on the battlefield. Okay, so finally, they were willing to grant her the status after she was in prison. Okay. Comment, questions? I think that, talk about how this works out in Israel. 1 or 2 other texts I wanted to point out. This came up again in Israel with the you may recall before, it's almost hard to remember what was going on in Israel before October 7th. Understandably. But you may recall that before October 7th, there were tremendous demonstrations within Israel about what was called the judicial reform. Netanyahu and his government, he has 64 seats in the Knesset. Remember, the Knesset, Israeli parliament, is made up of 120 seats. It's proportional representation. There is no direct election for the prime minister. The prime minister becomes prime minister because he or she, her party, has a majority of the seats in the Knesset. No one party has ever had a majority of seats in the Knesset, so it's always a coalition. And in order to keep over 60 seats, the prime minister has to keep all the members of the coalition happy. Because if 5 members of the coalition say, we don't like what you're doing, government falls and there's a new election. Am I explaining is that clear how the Israeli government works? I mean, it's a very brief explanation. So Netanyahu has a majority, and last spring, I guess it's a little later, it's 2023, his government proposed new legislation limiting Supreme Court oversight of government policies. There were huge demonstrations in Israel. The Knesset, the parliament, with the majority of those who backed Netanyahu, abolished a clause which the Supreme Court called the reasonableness doctrine. To be very simple, it was an attempt by Netanyahu's government to make the judiciary more amenable to what he was doing, rather than it was going to stymie the independence of the judiciary. It's a little complicated, but let's leave it at that. So what happened? IDF chief, reservist refusal to serve harms military national security. What happened? Calls by reservists to refuse to serve in protest of the government plans to overhaul the judicial system would cause harm. This is the IDF chief of staff, and people in the military were saying protests against the judicial overhaul have rippled through the IDF. 4,000 reservists. That's a significant. We're not talking about in the other cases. Remember, Yesh Gavul and those other ones. There are 50, 75, 4,000. Signed letters not to show up when their units were called. This is before October 7th. Okay. There's this group. There are a lot of political protests. Achim L'Neshek, Brothers in Arms, is all reservists. And Halevi, the head of the military, was saying, if we don't train today, the competence of the army will suffer. We'll be less prepared. Okay. We are allowed to disagree. We are allowed to debate and discuss. We are allowed to protest, but we are not allowed to harm in the name of one political opinion or another, the IDF, according to the defense minister. That's Gallant, who, by the way, is not one of Netanyahu's favorites. The two of them don't get along, quite frankly. Netanyahu actually fired him, but had to rehire him, and then recently was threatening to fire him again because they don't agree. But he realized that he couldn't because the defense minister has supporters too many people. So the head of the military, the defense minister, said we have to be united, not allow extreme statements from any side to harm the IDF. While the readiness of the IDF was not impacted, there were signs of harm to the internal cohesion of the military, as more and more open letters against the overhaul were published. This all was going on, but of course, what happened was October 7th. And once October 7th occurred, this all ended. And the reservists, who are part of the Army's routine activities, of course, went on to serve. But right now, the Netanyahu government is talking about reintroducing the judicial reforms. Who knows what will happen? It's really kind of seems to me politically dumb, but that's sort of the issues we have about refusal to serve individual conscience for the Israeli military. Okay. Any comments or questions on that whole subject? Comments, questions, individual. We did see individual conscience and how it plays out in Israel and in our tradition. So I wanted to then go on to a new topic. Okay. Comments, questions? All right. I need to open up a new file.
Sounds a little familiar in our country with the president dominating the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, well, I'll just point out that that an executive trying to change the rules of the judiciary does, in fact, sound very similar to what happens not only in our country, but what has happened in other countries where we have had, unfortunately, examples of executive branches taking more power and, quote, reforming, but actually trying to make the judiciary more subservient to to their will. Okay. So let's start something new. Let's this up. Everybody, okay, I started a new share. Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. I'm my screen is a little off. I gotta do something here. I'm not sure what, but I will try. Okay. Okay. What I want to do for the next class, this half of this class, and for the next class after, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is the highest authoritative body on Jewish law for the conservative movement. They recently came out with 2 opinions, which I think are worthwhile because they touch on things that we are studying. Let me ask you that question. Can you donate your body to medical education and research? If you're a Jew, can you do that? Why might you think you could, and why might you think you could not? What Jewish values might be in conflict in such a decision? Yeah, Tammy?
You're not supposed to desecrate the body, but on the other hand, you're supposed to further advancement in medical and save anybody's life you can save. And if you're looking at a body, you may be able to save future people.
Okay, so there are 2 things in conflict, exactly.
Well,
We have,
we're allowed to donate organs though, so what's the difference?
that's the question, is, well, if you donate a body, what do you bury? When's the Shiva? What do you do with, maybe something's left, what do you do with it? When do you start Shiva? Should you have Shiva? Right. We're allowed to, so the values, which we'll see in this teshuva, are, yes, kavod hamet, dealing with the body in an honorable way. And we do that, we always like to say, after someone dies, they're supposed to have a shomer, a person stay with the body from the time of death to the time of burial. There are a lot of differences in how this works out in reality. In many communities, I've said this before, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but New York and other parts of the world operate sometimes differently. Many communities will have a shomer, someone who watches, stays with the body. We had a series of volunteers in Nashville to stay with the body. In New York area, if you're not a part of a community that has someone to volunteer, and some synagogues do, you will have to pay a fee, right? The body is supposed to be buried in tafrichim. It's honorable to be buried in simple white clothing, to be washed, and then placed in the casket, a simple casket, and that the body decomposes naturally in a grave. Kavod hamet. Nivul hamet, not being honoring the body, would be things like routine autopsies. On more than one occasion, I have been called upon to speak to medical examiners about that. There are certain cases where either legally it may or may not be required, and the medical examiner may have some ability to decide that it's not necessary. And I can think of specifically 2 cases where I spoke to medical examiners where it was pretty clear why the person died, but because of other things, there was a possibility of an autopsy, and the family did not want it, so we did not have it. I'm glad to see that medical examiners were very agreeable on that. So you're not supposed to, routinely do autopsies. Autopsies are only required typically because there is a person who died under, quote, suspicious circumstances, or there's a possibility of foul play, or sometimes the law requires an autopsy if a person dies suddenly and had not been under a physician's care and they were aware of any sort of medical condition. Okay, so you're not supposed to do routine autopsy, and you're also not supposed to embalm, because embalming requires cutting into the body, draining the fluids, and inserting chemicals and so on. Okay. So how do we weigh that versus keep, the value of life? You want to keep people alive. And how does that all work out? So recently the Committee on Jewish Law, actually this is dated June 20th, 2024. So we are really up to date on this. We understand certain things about it, but is it permissible to donate your body for medical education and research based on the principle of pikuach nefesh, saving a life, and kavod hamet, respect for the dead, even though the general halakhic practice is to bury the deceased as soon as possible and to allow autopsies only in exigent circumstances? For example, you might allow an autopsy. Suppose the person had a disease, or we think they had a disease, and knowing about this will help us in the medical treatment of people who are related to the disease. We want to know about this particular disease and the people who are living, and therefore, once we do an autopsy, we can tell more about it and tell the living people how to improve their health. That's a classic example. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
One current example is that with the COVID pandemic, where they wanted to do autopsies to determine what the actual cause of death was, to see if they can trace the virus.
Oh, that's a good point too. Rather, it's not for immediate family, but there's a general public health issue, right? That if we know this was COVID, and we therefore must take precautions about people who are in contact with that person, right? Also, it would help us with knowing the what's the technical term where the disease is. There's a technical term for that. Okay.
Yeah, the location, the particular organs that it's going after, and
right. But also, I'm thinking also the physical location. Okay, this person was in Pittsburgh and he took a flight to Chicago and then he went to New York. Gee, we need to know that if it's COVID, because we got to talk about the people who he might have been in contact in those 3 places.
The epidemiology of it.
Epidemiology, Judith, we always are so glad to have you. Thank you. Okay. But this is a slightly different question. Part of medical training, as I think we all know, one of the early things doctors do in their training is to have a cadaver and to dissect and learn from that, right? There was a time where cadavers were hard to find. And, you hear about grave robbers. This was a real issue at one point. In England, in particular, in the 19th century, medical schools would pay a bonus to people who brought in a cadaver. And there was a problem of grave robbery, because there wasn't an easy flow of cadavers for this study of medicine. I actually just thought the whole idea of studying cadavers as is a valuable part of medical training, that's a relatively modern concept, right? I mean, when we think about it, and doctors will say this themselves, up until relatively modern times, in point of fact, there was very little that doctors could do. Oh, we'll bleed you, we'll try this other thing. But the knowledge of the body is a relatively modern phenomenon. So this is just, now we're talking about in general. I'll just donate my body to, I don't know, Columbia Presbyterian Medical School so the medical students can look at it. Okay, Carol, you're going to comment?
What about the idea of just donating a particular organ
Mm-hmm.
someone?
Right, we've looked at that before, and yes, you're right. Judaism in general says saving a life is a value that means we can donate organs. Yes, it does involve, shall we say, cutting into the body, nivul hamet, doing matters that are unnecessary. You have to cut in and take out the organ. That's correct. But that is overcome by our concern for saving life. Also, people, yeah, go ahead, Carol.
I recall a case of an American father whose daughter is killed, I think it was in Gaza, and he decided that he wanted to use her body to be able to donate for, I think it was for organ donation, but initially the state said, no, you couldn't do it. And eventually he was able to donate her body to medical science.
Okay, again, I'm not familiar with that particular case. The issue, and we had looked at this, but the issue sometimes you find in some of the more here we're talking really, really traditional people, is one, the definition of death, which for organ transplants, you really have to use brain death as the definition of death. And that allows I mean, look, if your brain's dead, you're dead. So that's an easier way of determining brain death. They didn't have brain death in Talmudic times. They had to talk about respiration and heartbeat, right? So respiration and heartbeat can be artificially sustained even after brain death, but the person's not coming back, right? So that had been an issue that all but the most traditional in the Jewish community say we'll accept brain death to allow for the organ transplants. I don't know anything about that specific case and how it came about, but certainly we allow for organ transplants. Here we're talking about a slightly different matter, because with an organ transplant, one could argue you are immediately taking an organ and you are immediately saving a life. Donating your body to a medical school for dissection by a medical student is a little bit removed from that, right? The value of saving lives is part of it, but the question here is it far enough removed that we might say, no, you really shouldn't do that? That's what we're I mean, I'll ask this question. Do any of you know anybody who donated their body to science? No, generally, this doesn't happen in the Jewish community. Actually, probably in the general community, probably doesn't happen too often, right? Mostly it's unclaimed bodies, from what I understand, that are used in medical schools. What if someone wanted to do this? And the person who wrote this, Rabbi Pamela Barmash, points out, I was inspired to write these because in less than 2 years, 3 rabbis and 1 chazan, the chazan was a spiritual leader of the congregation, asked about it. And since then, other rabbis have inquired, right? So she says, the rabbis immediately answered no, because, okay, that's the distinction. Donating the organ is an immediate benefit to save a life. But donating the body to a medical school, for example, or for research in some way, Wondered if donating for the sake of medical education and research is an act of chesed, loving kindness, and should be permitted. And then the question is, should we encourage it and praise it? That's even further, you know. Have you ever seen a rabbi? Has a rabbi ever said to you, you know, it's a really good thing to donate your body to science? Right? You know, that okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah, Judith.
I just wanted to comment, the use of cadavers in medical school and gross anatomy classes, because of technology and, for instance, back in the day, medical students, several each, a group had one cadaver per the group, and they worked on it to,
Right, they worked on it
learn
together.
to learn anatomy and function and this and that. As a physician assistant, we had an option. If we wanted to, we could have a cadaver, but you better commit yourself to it, because once you took a cadaver, you had to work on it throughout. Whereas the rest of the class had sections. So you would get a head or you would get a shoulder, and you could work on the anatomy. And it was even a little bit easier because some of the stuff was, color coded. But with COVID and the decrease in hands-on contact, those kind of labs and the learning from gross anatomy got integrated into other classes. So there's even less, and because of the fact that the virus was in the body, there was even less contact and less bodies.
Understandably. I also understand that there are, hey, I saw it on Shark Tank, so it has to be true. There are companies that are creating artificially a body that's not a real body, but that can be used like a body. I don't understand it either, but okay, Carol, you're muted.
My children who went to medical school, they were at Einstein in the early 80s, each had their own cadaver.
Okay, that was standard operating procedure from what I understand. I mean, the advantages, of course, is that A, they do it themselves, and two, also by having their own cadaver, there's great variation from person to person in some aspects of the body, so that the medical student can see, well, I see this diagram in my textbook, but the cadaver is a little bit different. So I'm used to the idea that when I really see real human beings, that what I see in my textbook may not exactly be like that, because I've seen a variation on that in a cadaver, right? I mean, that's another advantage that one could argue you have from working on a cadaver. Okay?
One of the other teaching goals of having the cadaver was up front, you weren't told what the person passed away from. And part of your exploration and dissection was to figure out what the cause of death was and learn the pathology from the body.
Okay, so there's the argument that having a cadaver is going to increase the value of the medical education and deepen the knowledge of the medical students, which ultimately leads to saving lives. But again, that is both in time and place much distanced from the idea of taking a kidney or a heart or a lung and using that for an organ transplant, which is a lot. By the way, and that's one of the questions, that's one of the classic questions that no matter how many times you say it, somebody, and I said it many times in sermons, in articles, but inevitably people would come up to me, because the general, in many, there are a lot of rules about traditional Judaism which most people don't observe, but it seems that the thought that we can't be organ donors seems to be commonly and mistakenly believed. Sorry about that. But the idea that we can't be organ donors is one of the classic misconceptions that frequently is believed within the Jewish community. Some of you may have heard people say about this, and they sort of are shocked. We can be? Yes. Okay. All right. So that's our general outlook. What is it? Is it possible, right? What are the use of cadavers? Analyze the halakhic issues, pastoral concerns. Okay. So here she begins, try to understand what it is to do that. Nearly all schools continue to use hand-on cadaver dissection, typically along with other methods. Okay, there are other methods, human remains, models, simulations. Certainly you can do a lot more online than you could in the past, but still there's something about the use of a real cadaver. Hands-on dissection is still necessary because it offers what other forms of anatomical training cannot. Okay, the human body is imperfect, imperfect and variable. Arteries branch out in different patterns. Pathological processes progress in different ways. So yes, the point she's making here is that despite all the advances we might have on the computer and on simulations, I don't know what virtual reality is going to do for this. Who knows? I'm sure they're working on it. You can guarantee they're working on it, but still, actually, isn't that I saw a commercial on TV about a surgeon practicing with virtual reality. Did you see that one? I don't know. Anyway, direct cadaver dissection allows the budding physician insight into physiological variety. Okay, sensing fine distinctions. Manual dissection allows both the medical student to learn basic anatomy and the expert devise and gain skill in new techniques, right? It may be that virtual will eventually advance to the level of fine detail, but that's still in the future. It is not, and the point that she makes is not just medical students at the introductory level who learn via hands-on dissections, but graduate physicians seeking to acquire special expertise and to make advances in medical techniques, right? I understand there are, Judith, you can correct me, there are medical seminars where a surgeon, for example, is learning to use a new pattern or new methods, and they keep coming up. And they do use cadavers or cadaver parts to practice, for example, different types of advances in surgical techniques. Is that correct, Judith? You may know this better than I. That's my understanding.
Oftentimes I can't swear to it. I don't know that they're using human parts because a lot of it is done, like if they're learning robotic techniques, they may be using, other animals or for simulation.
Okay, or assisting a person who already does the technique and learning it through. Well,
a lot of it is also like I'm thinking operatively, they'll go into a surgery and they'll observe,
right,
and then be taught hands-on there.
Right, that's a classic way that medical students are taught things, right? Ed, are you raising your hand? Yes?
Yeah, I know one other thing is when my daughter is a physical therapist, they got a cadaver as physical therapist.
I did not know that.
I don't know if they still do, but they had four students on one cadaver.
Okay.
The whole body.
Oh, the whole body. Okay. Good to know.
May have been missing the head, I'm not sure.
Hey, either way, it's still a donated body, right? Okay. Okay, donating a body and research involves possibly the clash, right? Delay in burial, right? In other words, let's say the body is being worked on and they're done. Okay, here's what's left. What do we do with what's left? Right? I mean, they got stuff that's left. Okay. The manipulation, the entirety may not be returned. Okay, so therefore we have the different principles. And there's the pastoral concerns. How do you do funerals and when do you start Shiva? Right? Okay, so there are all sorts of questions. So she wanted to direct, this is a very contemporary question. Okay, so she steps back a bit and starts to say, well, what are the principles, right? Pikuach nefesh, saving a life. Kavod hamet, respect for the deceased. As we said, how do they interrelate? sometimes at odds. Okay, sometimes affirming the same ruling, and sometimes they're going in different directions. Okay, all right. So she starts with pikuach nefesh, saving a human life. What's the classical text? It says, Rabbi, this is from the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe said, it is based upon that the Israelites shall keep the Shabbat. Well, we V'shamru b'nei Israel et Shabbat. We know that verse. It's in the Kiddush, and it's in the liturgy. The Torah meant desecrate one Shabbat on behalf of an ill person, so he will observe many Sabbaths. It's Talmudic, of course, it's male, so we understand that. But you might not think V'shamru b'nei Israel et Shabbat. Where does that go? And the rabbis, and let's face it, that's a bit of a stretch here, but they recognize that in the Torah itself, the whole value system of the Torah emphasizes so strongly the saving of life that they're reading into this verse, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, that means that, yes, it's important that you observe Shabbat. And if you have to desecrate one to get better, that's okay, right? Rabbi Judah said in the name of Samuel, if I would have been there at the earlier debate, I would have said that my proof is more decisive than Rabbi Shimon's. Oh, okay. And then you have that he has a different verse. The chai bahem. Okay. You should live by the mitzvot. You should observe my precepts and my statutes so that a person will live by them, not die by them. You shouldn't be observing something that might cause you to die, like not getting medical help when you get sick on Shabbat. Therefore, if the essence of living of the mitzvot is to live by them, you are allowed to a violation, something that you would be reluctant to do because you have to live. All right, so the rabbis are basically, what do? They agree, they're perfectly agreeable on the principle. They're disagreeing on the verse that it is based upon, right? The rabbis agree that a situation endangering human life mandates violating the Shabbat in order to preserve life, and their only disagreement is about which biblical verses serve as its proof text, right? It does not literally say in the Bible, you should violate Shabbat to keep yourself alive, but that's a value the rabbis all agree is there. They just disagree where we get it from. Okay. And then it gets a little technical in the Talmud, digging out a person caught in a collapsed building, digging out a collapsed building on Shabbat is again prohibited, generally prohibited, but you've got a person in there. So, what do you do? Or if there's a fire, right? A fire out of control requiring that it be contained on Shabbat. We have a fire and we're not sure how far it's going to go or if it's going to burn where people live. Even though it's Shabbat, we have to contain the fire because there is a potential danger to human life if the fire is not controlled. Okay. However, pikuach nefesh does apply to other things. An autopsy under the principle of pikuach nefesh. All right, the case of an individual with a specific disease, seeking the physician at the same time that an individual has died from that same disease. This is a little technical, and again, it's trying to narrowly define this. Because again, they recognize that an autopsy generally is not done because it involves cutting into the body and draining the fluids and cutting pieces out and all that other stuff. But initially, they try to be very narrow. Oh, this person died of disease X. We now have a person nearby who's also got that disease. If we do an autopsy, we may be able to discover medical information that will save that other person, right? The physician may learn how to heal another person suffering from the same disease at the same time. See how narrow, they're trying to do this very narrowly. But they did not deem the principle pikuach nefesh sufficient to allow dissection for general medical education or learning how to cure disease in the future. That was initially what we have a ruling. Okay, he's got whatever, and she's got it. Let's do that, which is different from a general permission about somebody donating their body to science and somebody having the knowledge from that. A principle of halacha less well known, yet clearly related to pikuach nefesh on both the conceptual and practical level is sakanat nefashot, general danger to human lives. It is required that we avoid danger to human life and do what we must to save human lives, even if the lives in question are not in immediate danger, right? So this question of, okay, we narrowly allow the autopsy because there's somebody right there who's got the disease. Well, now we don't have somebody right there who's got the disease. Is it possible then we can violate kavod hamet, honoring the dead, even without having somebody right there, right? And he's quoting from Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who was, one of the authors of the Shulchan Aruch. This goes back, several hundred years. One should avoid all things that might lead to a danger to life, because danger to life is stricter than a prohibition. One should be more concerned about a possible danger to life than a possible prohibition. Therefore, it is forbidden to walk in a dangerous place, like under a leaning wall. They also write that one should flee a city when there is a plague. One should go where the plague is in its beginning, not at its end, all because of the danger. And it's prohibited to rely on a miracle or to put one's life in danger, because hence we return to the principle of pikuach nefesh. Okay, sorry, I'm a little. Let me go back down here. Sakanat nefashot is a more general application than pikuach nefesh. It is far less analytically developed. In other words, exactly what is a danger to life? It's a general principle. And here you see this question, when you're applying some of the principles to a specific case, do you say this is a case that fits into the general rule, or no, it does not fit into the general rule? One needs to take sensible actions to avoid danger, but is this enough to permit medical dissection as part of the training of physicians? Does this rule, how far do we extend this rule? Does sakanat nefashot mean that we can pass a law in the United States Senate that you have to wear a seatbelt, right? Or, that one could argue that, well, that's sakanat nefesh, right? How about requiring that you have other safety features in a car, right? How far does that go? One could argue, well, there's a limit perhaps to how, you can go a little crazy with that principle. Okay, so she now turns to another principle called kavod hamet, respect for the deceased. The body of the deceased must be treated with dignity. This principle is expressed in a number of specific ways: burying the deceased as soon as possible, having a shomer, accompanying the casket. The principle also encourages a number of prohibitions, which is nivul hamet, disgracing the dead. Since medical dissection involves the examination, manipulation, and dissection of the deceased body, we must first examine whether nivul hamet prohibits medical dissection. In other words, is that sort of there's certainly certain things, we recognize, that it's nivul hamet. Needless to say, in certain medieval times, after they captured or killed soldiers or traitors, they'd hang the body up and do all sorts of terrible things. Okay, so the first thing we see, and I think we're gonna have to finish with this, debates whether the burial is to prevent nivul hamet, promote atonement by returning the body to the earth, and so we generally have, perhaps one might say, to do these dissections by doing them on non-Jewish corpses. This certainly should not be said, nor should such words be published. The prohibition of nivul hamet is about disgracing living human beings. That is to say, the disgrace occurs whether the body of a human being, born in the image of God, endowed with intelligence and understanding, safeguarding and holding its jurisdiction over all creation, is lying on the ground, decaying, applies to both Jewish and... So how you could say, oh no, we got medical schools, we'll deal with non-Jewish corpses, right? Therefore we're not going against nivul hamet. We're going to have to end here. Unfortunately, time is up. But we've got this question of, is it nivul hamet? And we will pick this up 2 weeks from today. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to finish it, but we'll go over it, finish it, and go on to this question. Next, the question will be, using animal parts in human bodies. Okay, Ed, question.
No question. I just checked with my younger daughter, which was like 10 years later than my older daughter.
Okay,
And yes, cadavers were, her first class was gross anatomy.
right.
Right off the bat, they wanted to weed them out.
You don't like cutting up a body? You really can't be a doctor. Okay, we get
This
it.
is physical therapist.
Not
Same
physical therapist. Have a good week, vote, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
You.
Well,
Take care.
thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank